Hello everyone and welcome back to our reading of Sasquatch, True Life Encounters with Legendary Ape Men. Or at least my copy says Sasquatch, True Life Encounters with Legendary Ape Men. Anyway, today's chapter, the Maracoxi. Let's get started. Primate Cryptids. In recent years, the word Maracoxi has become a generic term for any of the cryptid primates that are rumored to live in South America, especially in the rainforests and jungles of the tropical regions. In fact, several primate cryptids are said to live in the continent, going by such names as Aluxes, Garazis, Ejapans, Vasitris, Matuyas, Curapirus, Currencreans, Monogrande, and Mapinguari. However, whether or not each name indicates a different cryptid is unclear. Some or all of the names might refer to the same creature. The Maracoxi themselves are, or were, supposed to be an extremely primitive tribe of hominids living in the Mato Grosso. This is a vast upland region of southern Brazil and northern Paraguay that is characterized by forest and dense stands of a viciously intertwined scrub, the motto of the area's name. The area covers around 500,000 square miles, and although the fringes have been cleared in recent years for soybean farming and cattle ranching, much of the interior remains untouched. It was even more remote when in 1914 Colonel Percy Fawcett pushed into the area with 2 English companions and a small team of local porters. Fawcett had been born in Torquay in 1867, and after a distinguished career in the British Army, he was hired by the Bolivian government to explore and survey its more remote regions. Other commissions from South American governments followed, so Fawcett was busily engaged in mapping large areas and establishing where vaguely defined international borders went. On these journeys into largely unexplored regions, Fawcett was told many stories about a highly advanced civilization that had formerly ruled and controlled a huge area of the rainforest. The local tribes told him that this rich and sophisticated people had formerly ruled the less advanced peoples with an iron hand and much brutality, but that they had disappeared some generations earlier. Fawcett became convinced that there had, in the recent past, been a civilization akin to the Aztec or the Maya, somewhere in the interior. By studying the stories, he was told, and accounts in old books, Fawcett thought the center of this civilization had been in the Mato Grosso. In 1914, he pushed into the utterly unexplored area in search of the ruins of stone cities and mighty temples. He first headed for the Cordillera dos Pereces. After some weeks, Fawcett and his companions discovered a tribe called the Maxubi. Fawcett eagerly noted that these people were sun worshippers and had some advanced astronomical knowledge. Believing he was close to success, he pushed on even though the Maxubi had warned him that he was entering the territory of the Maracoxi. The Maracoxi were little better than animals and were highly dangerous, he was told. Fawcett dismissed the stories as being merely a sign that the 2 tribes were hostile to each other. Sounds in the undergrowth. Several days after leaving the Maxubi, Fawcett heard the sounds of humans moving about in the undergrowth around his camp at night. The intruders had gone by morning, so Fawcett pushed on. He later recorded in his diary what happened next. In the morning we went on, and within a quarter of a mile came to a sort of palm leaf sentry box, then another, Then, all of a sudden, we reached open forest. The undergrowth fell away, disclosing between the tree bones a village of primitive shelters, where squatted some of the most villainous savages I have ever seen. Some were engaged in making arrows. Others just idled, great ape-like brutes who looked as if they had scarcely evolved beyond the level of beasts. They were large, hairy men with exceptionally long arms, and with foreheads sloping back from pronounced eye ridges. Men of a very primitive kind, in fact, and stark naked. I whistled, and an enormous creature, hairy as a dog, leapt to his feet in the nearest shelter, fitted an arrow to his bow in a flash, and came up dancing from one leg to the other, till he was only 4 yards away. Emitting grunts that sounded yook, 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 he remained there dancing, and suddenly the whole forest around us was alive, with these hideous ape-men, all grunting and advancing from leg to leg in the same way as they strung arrows to their bows. It looked like a very delicate situation for us, and I wondered if it was the end. I made friendly overtures in the Maxubi tongue, but they paid no attention. It was as though human speech were beyond their powers of comprehension. The creature in front of me ceased his dance, stood for a moment perfectly still, and then drew his bowstring back till it was level with his ear, at the same time raising the barbed point of the 6-foot arrow to the height of my chest. I looked straight into the pig-like eyes, half hidden under the overhanging brows, and knew that he was not going to loose that arrow yet. As deliberately as he had raised it, he now lowered the bow, and commenced once more the slow dance and the yoke, yoke, yoke. A second time he raised the arrow at me and drew the bow back, and again I knew he would not shoot. It was as the Maxubis told me it would be. Again he lowered the bow and continued his dance. Then, for the third time, he halted and began to bring up the arrow's point. I knew he meant business this time, and drew out a Mauser pistol I had on my hip. It was a big clumsy thing of a caliber unsuitable for forest use, but I had brought it because, by clipping the wooden holster to the pistol butt, it became a carbine and was lighter to carry than a true rifle. It used 38 black powder shells, which made a din out of all proportions to their size. I never raised it. I just pulled the trigger and banged it off into the ground at the ape-man's feet. The effect was instantaneous. A look of complete amazement came into the hideous face, and the little eyes opened wide. He dropped his bow and arrow and sprang away as quickly as a cat to vanish behind a tree. Then the arrows began to fly. We shot off a few rounds into the branches, hoping the noise would scare the savages into a more receptive frame of mind. But they seemed in no way disposed to accept us, and before anyone was hurt, we gave it up as hopeless and retreated down the trail till the camp was out of sight. We were not followed, but the clamour in the village continued for a long time as we struck off northward, and we fancied we still heard the yook, yook, yook of the enraged braves. Other early travellers also heard stories about these people, how they had a supernaturally strong sense of smell that they used when hunting, how they killed and ate humans, how they lived underground, and how they were active only at night. All the neighbouring tribes and peoples firmly agreed that the Maracoxi were very primitive and very dangerous, as well as being completely covered in hair and physically different from other tribes. There is no reason at all to doubt that Fawcett encountered these Maracoxi in the way that he said he did. He may have been fanatical about his belief in the lost Amazonian civilization, but he was a seasoned explorer and an astute observer of wildlife, geological features, and flora. It seems most likely that he accurately reported his encounter with the legendary Maracoxi. He did, however, react as would a person of his time and view the Maracoxi through the lens of his own preconceptions. He was out looking for signs of an advanced race of astrologer princes living in stone palaces, not a bunch of hairy tribesmen. No doubt he overemphasized the primitiveness of the Maracoxi when he used phrases such as villainous savages and ape-men, but that does not mean that his actual descriptions are wrong. Stripped of his emotive adjectives, Fawcett's descriptions are of a fully human creature, but one with some markedly different physical characteristics. The most striking of these are thick hair all over the body, heavy brow ridges, and a forehead sloping backwards. None of these are typical of Homo sapiens sapiens, the subspecies to which we belong. It must be admitted, however, that we really do not know at what point in our evolution we humans lost our hairy covering. That subspecies evolved somewhere in northeast Africa around 130,000 years ago, and then spread out across the world. The rate at which fully modern humans spread and when they arrived in different areas is a matter of some conjecture. What is not in doubt is that in most areas they ousted older forms of human beings. In Europe, the Neanderthal people had existed for many tens of thousands of years before fully modern humans arrived and drove them to extinction, though there may have been some limited interbreeding. These Neanderthals are generally classed as another species of modern human, Homo sapiens neanderthalensis. They were originally from the same species as ourselves, but they had markedly different physical features that seem to have been linked to surviving in an Ice Age environment. For instance, they had more robust bodies, bigger noses, heavy brow ridges, and skulls more elongated front to back than ours. Their average skull size was, however, the same as ours, and there was no reason to believe that they were any less intelligent than ourselves. In Southeast Asia, it seems to have been humans of a different species, Homo erectus, that were ousted when fully modern humans arrived about 90,000 years ago or so. This species had a smaller brain capacity, and the tools that they made were rather more primitive than those used by modern humans. There is, for instance, no evidence that they ever mastered the making of bows, arrows, or even hafted axes. They did, however, use fire for warmth and cooking. Their heads were smaller, with extremely heavy brow ridges and a forehead that sloped back so severely that it almost did not exist. In the Americas, the situation is rather obscure. No fossils of any form of human have ever been found that predate the arrival of fully modern humans. That does not mean that no forms of humans lived there before that time, merely that no fossil trace has been found of them. Given the vagaries of fossil formation and the paucity of rocks of the correct age, this is perhaps not surprising. It may well be that some form of early human got to America across a land bridge from Asia at some point in the remote past. The description given of the Maracoxi of the Mato Grosso would certainly fit this scenario. It might be unlikely that a small tribe of an earlier form of the genus Homo has survived, but it is not impossible given the relatively late arrival of fully modern humans in the Americas. If an isolated band of Homo erectus or some primitive subspecies of Homo sapiens were to survive anywhere, it would be in a place that is remote from the point of entry of fully modern humans and in an environment where a limited stone toolkit might not be a great hindrance to survival. The forests of South America fit both bills. Outside the Mato Grosso, hairy humans have been reported from the forests that blanket the eastern slopes of the lower Andes in Colombia and Ecuador. There they are known as the Chiru, but otherwise they seem very similar to the Maracoxi. Reports are sparse, however. Rather better known are the Vasitri of the Orinoco Basin, where they are also known as the Achi or Agapan. The Vasitri are, like the Maracoxi, quite obviously humans, because they construct huts or shelters and use weapons and tools. They are, however, covered in hair and are looked upon as primitive or animal-like. Again, like the Maracoxi, they are also described as being very dangerous and willing to hunt humans. They have the additional habit of kidnapping women for breeding purposes. The first outsider to record these stories was the great German naturalist Baron Alexander von Humboldt, who mapped much of the Orinoco River in the early 1800s. He wrote this report. On the Orinoco it is rumored the existence of a hairy man of the woods called Salvage that carries off women, constructs huts, and sometimes eats human flesh. The Tamanaks called him Achi, and the Mapers named him Vasitri, or Great Devil. The natives and the missionaries have no doubt of the existence of this man-shaped monkey, of which they entertain a singular dread. Father Gilly gravely relates the history of a lady in the town of San Carlos, in the Llanos of Venezuela, who much praised the gentle character and attentions of the man of the woods. She is said to have lived several years with one in great domestic harmony, and only requested some hunters to take her back, because she and her children were weary of living far from the church and the sacraments. Rather older are the reports of the Mono Grande, which translates as giant monkey. As its name suggests, this beast is usually described as being a very large monkey that stands about 5 feet tall. It often reacts badly to humans, thrashing branches about, screaming aggressively, and charging at intruders. These seem to be mere displays, however, because very few people have reported being injured by a Mono Grande. A similar creature goes by the name of the Didi. Confusion abounds regarding these two animals, and they may yet turn out to be the same thing. Both live in the same area, the dense forests of northern South America, and both are about the same size and have similar habits. The key difference is that the Mono Grande has a short tail while the Didi has no tail at all. Cryptozoologists generally view the former as a form of monkey and the latter as an ape. However, the Didi may not be an ape as such, but a monkey that has evolved into a tailless form. The truth will not be known until the skeleton can be obtained and studied. These two creatures will be treated here as if they are one cryptid that has been reported in different ways by witnesses and observers. However, it may turn out that they really are two quite distinct, though very similar cryptid primates in this region. One that has a tail, and one that does not. A book written in 1553 by the Spanish explorer Pedro de Cieza de Leon features the first written report of a Mono Grande. He mentions that the local tribesmen told him about this creature, but that he never saw one himself. In 1769, the naturalist Edward Bancroft wrote an essay on the natural history of Guyana, in which he mentions local tales of a hairy 5-foot-tall ape. It is much larger than either the African ape or the Oriental ape, if the accounts of the natives may be relied upon. They are represented by the Indians as being near 5 feet in height, maintaining an erect position, and having a human form, thinly covered with short black hair, but I suspect that their height has been augmented by the fears of the Indians, who greatly dread them. A melancholy whistle. In 1860, another British naturalist, Philip Gosse, also picked up the tales, but he thought that they related to an ape. There may exist a large anthropoid ape not yet recognized by zoologists, he concluded. 8 years later, Charles Bryan was on the upper Mazaruni when he heard a most peculiar animal call. He described it as follows: "A long, loud, and most melancholy whistle. 2 or 3 times the whistle was repeated, sounding like that made by a human being, beginning in a high key and dying slowly, and gradually away into a low one." Brown asked his local porters what had made the cry. They told him that it was the Didi, which they described as a short, thick-set and powerful wild man whose body is covered with hair, and who lives in the forest. Brown later met a man who had blundered across a male and a female Didi when out chopping timber one day. They had attacked him, scratching him badly, but he had defended himself with his axe, and they had fled. In 1910 came the first reported sighting of the elusive ape or giant monkey. A British gold prospector named Haynes came out of the forests and said that he had encountered a pair of hairy apes as big as a man. Haynes said that when he first saw them, the 2 creatures had been squatting down, but they had stood up when they saw him. The creatures were only a few feet away along the forest path, when Haynes strolled round a corner. They watched him carefully for a moment, and then backed off into the undergrowth, while still keeping their eyes fixed on him. After they disappeared from view, they seemed to rush off. 10 years later, another European saw the creature in the forests, and this time he got a photograph of it. Like the Patterson movie of an alleged Sasquatch, this photograph has become a classic of cryptozoology, one that has thrown up as many disputes as answers. Dead animal. Francois Deloy was a Swiss geologist who in 1917 was hired to explore the Sierra de Perija area along the Colombian-Venezuela border. Part of his task was to demarcate the border, but mostly he was to prospect for the oil, gas, and other natural resources that were thought to be in the area. Very definitely in the area were the Motalone, a tribe that had previously shown itself to be violently opposed to European intrusions. Deloy took with him a team made up of geologists, surveyors, armed guards, and porters. He did not take naturalists because he did not need any for the task of oil prospecting. By 1920, the team were camped near the Tara River, some miles southwest of Maracaibo. 2 large animals were seen approaching the camp through the undergrowth. Deloy at first thought that they were bears, but then he saw that they were more like very large monkeys. They seemed to be extremely angry with the humans. The creatures were screaming, shouting, and thrashing at the bushes. They then tore branches off the undergrowth and started brandishing them overhead as if they were weapons. Working themselves up into a pitch of fury, the two creatures then defecated into their hands and hurled the filth at the humans. Worried, Deloy and two other men picked up their rifles, scanning the surrounding jungle for signs of other angry giant monkeys. One of the creatures then dashed towards the humans. Deloy fired, dropping the animal dead in its tracks. The other creature fled into the undergrowth and vanished from sight. Deloy and his team picked up the dead animal and carried it back to camp. They measured it and studied it thoroughly. The creature was 5 feet 2 inches from its feet to the top of the head. It had no tail, and its limbs were stout and muscular compared to those of most monkeys, while its body was thinner from the front to the back than he had expected. The creature had 32 teeth. Having taken these measurements, Deloy sat the creature on a wooden storage crate, propped it upright with a stick, and took its photograph. At the time of the incident, Deloy questioned his porters, who all came from the coastal regions. They said that they had no idea what the creature was, but everyone agreed it was some sort of monkey. The beast was then skinned by the expedition cook, who was accustomed to dealing with all sorts of wild animals that had been shot for food. He cut off the head, boiled it to remove the flesh, and kept the skull. Unfortunately, the canoe which was carrying the skin and the skull overturned some weeks later, and both items were lost to posterity. Deloy completed his mission later that year, wrote up his geological notes for his employers, and went back home to Europe. Once there, he embarked on other geological work, but made no secret of the fact that he had kept voluminous notes during his South American journeys. They covered local wildlife, local tribes, and other matters, and several people came to inspect his notes for their own research. In 1929, the anthropologist Professor Georges Matondo visited Deloy to research South American tribes. As he flipped through Deloy's notes, he spotted the photograph of the mystery monkey and asked what it was. Deloy retold the story of the encounter. Montandon realized that the creature, as described by Deloy, was completely unknown to science. More strikingly, if the beast turned out to be an ape, it would be a real landmark, because no apes were known to live in the Americas. Montandon quizzed Deloy in an attempt to extract all the details he could recall. He then studied Deloy's notes assiduously while constantly referring to the photograph. Finally, Montandon published a description of the animal in the Journal de la Société des Americanistes and gave a talk to the French Academy of Sciences. He gave the creature the scientific name of Ameranthropoide loise, meaning Loy's American ape. By giving the creature this name, Montandon did himself no service. The idea of there being an ape in America was opposed by nearly every zoologist of any repute. The furor that followed not only cast doubt on the already questionable identification of the animal as an ape, but went on to question the reality of the animal itself. Sir Arthur Keith, a prominent anthropologist, accused Deloy of lying. Keith suggested that the photo was of a perfectly normal spider monkey with its tail hidden out of sight. He also pointed out that all known South American monkeys have 36 teeth, not 32. So well respected was Keith, and so apparently ridiculous the idea of an American ape, that the subject appeared closed. Deloy, needless to say, was furious. He denied lying and denied trickery. He repeatedly stated that at the time of the encounter, he, as a geologist, had no idea that the presence of a large tailless primate was as remarkable as it turned out to be. He thought the beast was somewhat unusual, which is why he photographed it and measured it so carefully. If he had known how unusual the beast was, he would have taken more photographs and tried to preserve its skeleton. In vain did Deloy claim to have done his best. The zoological world wasn't interested. Deloy gave up and went back to geology. Reappraisal. In the intervening years, there has been a reappraisal of the photo and Deloy's claims. As Keith suggested, the animal in the photograph does indeed look very much like a spider monkey. In particular, it looks a bit like an Atlas spider monkey. For instance, the shape of the nose and the mouth are particularly distinctive, the nostrils being wide apart and separated by a flat area. The general proportions of the limbs and the arrangement of the toes and the fingers are also typical of spider monkeys. However, there are differences. The face of the mystery animal is a rounded oval, not the roughly triangular shape more usual in spider monkeys. There is also the creature's size. The crate on which it is photographed is a standard one for the time, and those crates were all 18 inches high. Since the creature is just over 3 times the height of the crate, that would make it just over 5 feet tall. Deloy said it was 5 feet 2 inches tall, so he would seem to have been vindicated on this point. There is no way of knowing from the photograph whether the creature had a tail, nor does the photograph show the number of teeth. There is only the word of Deloy to trust on either point. However, subsequent studies of spider monkeys have shown that although they generally have 36 teeth, it is not at all unusual for individuals to have 34 or 32, because the third molar does not always grow. Deloy might be proved right. At the very least, what he said no longer appears as ridiculous as it did when Sir Arthur Keith wrote his damning critique. Whatever the case, sightings of the creature have continued. In 1930, a hunter named Inocencio was out near the headwaters of the Urubu River. On one occasion, he found himself unable to get back to camp before dark. Having seen recent signs of jaguar, Inocencio climbed a tree and settled himself into a fork so that he could see the ground around quite clearly. Then he loaded his gun and settled down for a sleepless night. About 3 hours after sunset, Inocencio heard a cry that sounded almost human. Some time later, he heard it again. It now sounded closer. Then it came a third time, this time much closer. Inocencio was by now a bit alarmed, because he did not recognize the call at all. Then came the sound of a large animal, moving cautiously through the undergrowth. Looking in the direction from which the sound had come, Inocencio saw a creature moving beside a fallen Samameria tree. It then stepped out into the starlight. The figure was that of a thick-set being that stood upright like a man, but was somehow different. After turning its head to stare at Inocencio, it tipped its head back and let rip a terrific roaring sound. Inocencio fired, and the creature again roared loudly and started running forwards, as if determined to attack. Inocencio shot again, and this time he seemed to hit the creature, which sprang backwards. It fled back to the Sanomera tree and disappeared into the inky shadows, where it began growling and roaring. Inocencio fired for a third time, aiming blindly towards the tree. At this, the creature fell silent, then roared again, but from further off, the noises continued to retreat until they finally faded out of earshot. Curious stink. When dawn arrived, Inocencio clambered down. He found the clearing around the fallen tree spattered with blood, but not enough to indicate that the mysterious creature had been fatally wounded. Many branches were broken or bent, and there was a curious stink that Inocencio did not recognize. In 1980, Fernando Neves was out hunting near Puerto Ayacucho on the Orinoco when he spotted 3 giant monkeys on the banks of the river. Each one was about 5 feet tall and covered in reddish-brown hair. 5 years later, Ecuadorian botanist Benigno Malo was in the dense forest looking for fungi when he saw a large ape-like creature coming towards him. It was over 4 feet tall, and it looked rather like a chimpanzee. When it spotted Malo, it made off. Sightings by locals are numerous, but they cause little comment because the witnesses come from a culture where the reality of the creature is fully accepted. Only rarely do such cases get recorded. In 1990, Mark Miller and his daughter Christian organized a 5-strong expedition up the Ventuari and Orinoco rivers and their assorted tributaries in order to investigate the reports. They took with them not only the Deloy photo, but also photographs of spider monkeys, chimpanzees, gorillas, and other primates. The plan was to find people who had seen the mystery giant monkey ape, collect detailed accounts, and then show them the photographs to see if they could identify what they had seen. The expedition collected a number of eyewitness reports and managed to put together a picture of a giant monkey that tallied well with the Deloy photograph. Standing about 5 feet tall, it is covered in reddish-brown hair, and it has arms that reach down to its knees. It eats fruits, particularly the fruits of the chonta palm, and is found most often in the hills at altitudes of over 2,000 feet. The creature is not common, but neither is it particularly rare. It seems to be wary of humans, and while it will usually flee, it might become aggressive if cornered. The Millers may have returned from the dense forests certain of the reality of the giant monkey or ape, but the scientific establishment remains unconvinced. It is a reality to the locals, but yes, maybe the scientific establishment should actually listen. Anyway, that's all for today. I'll see you all next time where we return to Asia. I'll see you then. See ya!